Day. And joining us now, Ash Edwards, coastal Mississippi entrepreneur and former president and CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Council. Ash, good morning, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Gerard. Thanks for having me today.
You bet. So we have been talking quite a bit this morning about, I guess, what is on the top of everyone's mind across the country, if not the world, and that's the banking crisis. You know, to me, this feels a little bit more like the 80s, the mid-80s. Of course, you're an entrepreneur. You know a little bit about finance and capital and raising capital and all that entails. Well, what I recall is going to commercial banks in 1985, fresh off the S&L crisis. Very similar situation. They were sitting on lots of bonds and in investment instruments that carried very low interest rates, and the Fed was propping rates up to try to rid the nation of this sticky inflation. And you couldn't get a $100,000 loan on a $200,000 piece of property back then. It was that tight. And I think at that point, however, some 1,000 S&Ls went down. And it was tough for a budding entrepreneur who didn't really understand all of those intricacies to try to get capital. So we're not quite at that point, but it sure does smell bad. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. You know, look, I made the comment, I think, when I was on Paul Gallo's show a few months back, and we were talking about the Fed. And I said, look, the Fed is going to continue to raise rates until something breaks. Perhaps this is the first signs of something breaking. But look, you know, the interesting thing about it is the way this is going to fundamentally change the Fed's approach to interest rate hikes. We're likely going to see them pause. You probably agree with that. But someone asked me today, well, look, aren't we going to just have the same problems if they pause? And I said, well, what's going to happen with the crisis that we're seeing in the banking system right now is that credit's going to tighten so much that lending is going to just cease to exist in the ways that we've seen it over the last few years, which is also going to have a cooling effect on the economy. In fact, maybe even more so than some of what the Fed was planning to do. So, you know, one way or another, this is going to continue to, I think, affect the economy, even without the Fed continuing to hike rates. But, what's incredible to me, Gerard, is just how quickly this happened. And for the average consumer out there who's doing their banking, you know, they can't read a bank's balance sheets the way a Wall Street analyst can. And so the ability for people to know if their money is safe and the way that this kind of brings that into question is interesting. Now, I think most people's money is safe in the American banking system, but certainly we're going to see more bank failures before this ends.
I think you're right about that. And I may differ a little bit with you. I actually think the Fed is it's a safe face. I think they're going to give us a 1/4 point hike when they meet on the 22nd. And that's not going to be met with very positively by investors. So I'm watching the markets down 658 at this point. Got it on the screen here. On a day where we saw the PPI come in lower than expected, actually declined. And that's, of course, a harbinger of future retail pricing, inflation, consumer pricing. We would normally see the market going crazy thinking, well, the Fed's going to pause. This is their reason right here. But I think Jerome Powell is just so intransigent about this. And I could be wrong, and I hope you're right, honestly. I hope we do see a pause, but they've got a dilemma on their hands, a quandary, because you've got data saying, well, we need to pause because it looks like inflation's coming in check. And then on the other hand, you've got this situation with the banks. It's a tough deal, and I think they're lying in the bed that they made.
I completely agree with that. I mean, you know, look, there have been, I think, warnings coming from Wall Street throughout the entire Fed's rate hiking process here that says, you know, you guys are going to keep raising rates until you break something. But when you break something, are you prepared for what's going to come, you know, at that point? And of course, guys that watch this stuff, they know what the pattern is. You're going to see rate hike, rate hike, rate hike. And then suddenly there's going to be enough economic uncertainty and trouble, they're going to have to start decreasing rates. And that could happen in quick succession. I mean, you see exactly what's happening in the market right now. They're already pricing in rate decreases for later this year, which, is
Right.
yet to be seen. But look, I would not be surprised if what you predict does come true. I think you're right. I think Jerome Powell is absolutely tied to the hip now, to the strategy that he has espoused, that he espoused again last Tuesday, obviously before the news of SVB hit. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. But, it's going to create, I think, a lot of continued volatility in the market. We were up yesterday significantly, down significantly today. You're already seeing some of this contagion spread to the European financial markets. That's going to continue. Um, you know, and look, someone I was talking about this with someone yesterday, and they said, "Well, what banks can withstand this?" The truth of the matter is, if the depositors make a run on any bank, they're going to fail. I mean, there's no
With
bank that's got enough money to cover all the depositors that are out there, especially the uninsured depositors. Um, Hopefully that won't happen, but we're in such a different age now, because rather than having lines of people, lined up outside the bank teller stations, this is all digital today. So,
That's right.
the ability for a run to begin, and the way that can trickle down through the markets quickly, that's a scary proposition.
It is. It really, since, as you know, Ash, banks have practiced what's called fractional banking. Ever since then, you're exactly right. If there's a run, they can't withstand that. What this means, let's talk about what this means to Mississippians, where a lot of folks do business with community banks and banks that are not national banks. They're not part of the too big to fail set of banks. The concern I have, Ash, is that we're going to see a boost in regulations. We're probably going to see the ceiling go back down, perhaps to $50 billion, where all these various stress tests are applied. And then what happens is these community banks just kind of clam up and say, "Oh, we got to be careful," and we're back to that era again, where you can't get any money.
That's right. I think you're absolutely right about that. And, look, I know some of these bankers that run the community banks that are smaller or regional size here in Mississippi. And for the most part, they've got very good leadership, very conservative investment strategies, and
Good
probably
boards.
most of the people are going to be safe. But that's certainly not the case across the country, as you know. But I think you're absolutely right. And you're already seeing it in the narratives coming out of Washington. I mean, the thing that I'm seeing over and over this morning is people saying, look, this stress testing is going to have to come down to a lower threshold, because the changes that were made, the regulations that rolled back, have allowed this to happen. So there's no question that's going to be the next big push here. And you're absolutely right. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's going to be continuing tightening of credit markets, and that's going to really slow down, I think, a lot of economic activity, and that could stick in the economy for a while. And so, the difficulty is, when the Fed talks about cooling off the economic engine, well, when you run that engine out of gas, it takes a while to get it restarted sometimes. I don't know how much patience the American consumer is going to have for that kind of economic uncertainty over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and that's my concern, Ash, is that if, again, in our state, we're not as flush with the national banks. I think we have a very vibrant and very well-managed community banking world. But when the regulators step in, they start to change their tune, because they're forced to, essentially, when they're subjected to all these various stress tests. And they got controller of currency staff in their midst year-round is what happens.
That's right. I mean, and it can be burdensome and cumbersome. And, look, I mean, you understand what the federal government's trying to do here. They're trying to maintain and ensure the solvency of the American banking system, and that's a good goal to have. I don't know that the means always justify the ends, and so
Right.
But look, we're overdue probably for a very thorough relook at federal policy as it relates to the financial systems. All the things that have happened this year just underline that point more and more. And so hopefully this will be a way for some of that to begin to modernize over time to reflect the new realities of the financial world, which aren't what they were in 2008 during the financial crisis.
Totally agree. We're up against a break. Can you hang around? Want to talk to you about the legislative session. Get your views on that. You good to go? You
Sure,
good to
I'll
stay
hang
with
around.
us? All right. We
I
got
will.
Ash Edwards from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, an entrepreneur, and also the former president CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Council. We're coming right back in the Element Wealth students into this segment. We've got Ash Edwards on the line with us. So, Ash, final thing that I'll get your reaction to concerning this whole banking debacle is Larry Fink, of course, the CEO of BlackRock. He says he fears more seizures, more closures. He says this is a result of decades of easy money. And he also, this is what really got the markets concerned. He wrote a 20-page letter to his shareholders. And he said he expects inflation to be very sticky in the 3.5% to 4% range for years. And that was not received too well, as you can imagine, by the investment community, because that portends of continued aggressive rate hikes on the part, or certainly staying at a relatively high level on the part of the Fed, which just makes the cost of capital more expensive and hurts equities, the whole drill there. What do you think about Fink? Is he overreacting here? What do you think?
Look, it's tough to tell. I've been reading some of the analysis, and the losses on some of these balance sheets that are starting to come to light now are staggering. I mean, it's scary to see that. And so I think there is more to it probably than most people know. By that same nature, I also think that there's probably a little bit of leveraging going on here, in the sense that the more that something is made to be a crisis, the more likely that really important, or I should say aggressive federal intervention will come to help kind of bail things out on the back end. And of course the White House was very careful to say yesterday, we've not bailed anybody out. I don't want to argue semantics with them, but I would not be surprised if there aren't some bailouts coming at some point. Certainly, if you start to see an institutional type of weakness here, that's going to hit a lot of banks. And of course, just from a pragmatic perspective, Gerard, I ask myself, how could there not be more of this? Because we know that these banks were heavily invested in, a lot of banks were heavily invested in bonds that have now turned upside down. And so to the extent that a lot of banks were managing their internal financials and their internal portfolios this way, it's very likely that we're going to see just repeats of what's happened with SVB. And what's amazing to me, though, is people weren't even really talking about this Thursday of last week at this time. By Friday, you were just starting to hear some of it come out. The speed at which we can identify what is really a very major crisis in the American financial sector that's a little bit scary. Now, I've read that J.P. Morgan and Moody's and others had started to kind of draw attention to this a few months back, but still, it's sort of like where were the regulators? Where were all the things that would give us some inkling that this was coming as quickly as it came?
It's amazing. I talked about it on the show when we got started, that you got regulators and then you've got the supervisory function of the Fed. Where were they? I mean, it's in Mary Daly. She's the chair of the San Francisco Fed. It's in her backyard there. Where were her folks? And then where were bank regulators, of course, which is a different group. And then you got their financial auditors, which happens to be KPMG. I looked it up, since 94. Where were they? I mean, they just issued an unqualified opinion, and then 2 months later, the thing explodes. I think they got some splaining to do they not?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the mix that was in this bank, the depositors that were in there, I mean, a large percentage of American venture capital was sitting in that bank. A lot of major companies had money sitting in that bank. I mean, so, this was more than just a regional bank. This was a very economically significant bank in the grand scheme of things. And you think about what could have been. I mean, you look, obviously the investors are left holding the bag on this. The depositors will be made whole. But this is not over by any stretch of the imagination.
I got to tell you, Ash, when I went to the commercial banking world to borrow a dab of money, honestly, to start my company, it was a very small company, I got kicked to the curb just regularly for about 12, 14 months, saying no, no, no. And it was because I didn't have any what they call collateral. Imagine that. You've got to have some sort of security to perfect these loans that they could rely on that could cover a default. But in this case, they were loaning money out, almost acting as a VC, which also happened to be their depositors as well. I mean, it's just a cozy relationship there. You just know that's not going to work. They're loaning money on air. That's what private equity and VC firms do, not commercial banks.
That's right. Well, it's the old saying, there's nothing as expensive as free money. And, the years of having zero or near zero interest rates are rearing their head very quickly here. Of course, look, I was, what has it been, 2 or 3 years ago now when Trump was president and he was advocating for going below zero with interest rates. And, I said that was a bad idea. And I think people are starting to see why. I mean, it's a dangerous situation. And as you mentioned before, 3 to 4% sustained inflation is going to be very, very tough on the American economy and the world economy.
Yeah,
of course,
no
the
doubt.
Fed's target is 6%, but that seems like a pipe dream at this point.
I totally agree. So what did you think about the legislative session? We'll turn our focus to that a little bit.
Well,
Still going on, of course.
There's a lot going on. I follow the legislative session closely. I have always been probably well known for being a little critical of the Mississippi legislature. That's not going to change today. But they've got some big issues in front of them this year. This is a much more important legislative session than I think we see in a lot of election years when some of these types of issues kind of get pushed to the back burner. And it's been interesting to kind of watch the changes that have occurred. I will say this, Gerard. I think the overwhelming kind of takeaway from this legislative session is there is no sort of standard political philosophy that is governing in the Mississippi legislature. There are very conservative things that happen. Then there are things that go very much against sort of conservatism and free market principles. And so, if you can predict which way the legislature is going to go, I salute you, because it's one of those things that you just never know where these things are going to end up.
I agree with you totally, Ash. I think that that folks have sort of taken on their own definition of what it means philosophically to be liberal, to be conservative, and there's no consensus on that wherever you land in the political spectrum. And it seems like that chart just keeps getting wider. You could land somewhere between the far left and the far right, and then every day it seems like we keep pushing the extremes out further on both sides. So I agree, and I think that nowhere is that more evident than perhaps the three people who were most responsible for legislation in the state, that being our Speaker of the House, the Lieutenant Governor presiding over the Senate, and then the Governor. I'm not sure how much alignment of their philosophy and views exists.
I think you're right, and I think we've seen the evidence of that. Look, it's tough. They've got tough roles. I don't want to be overly critical, but and they're hearing from a lot of different people every day. Legislative session is a very tough session, but oftentimes I think I look at the decisions that are being made, and I oftentimes wish that there was a little bit more transparency, a little bit more debate, a little bit more consideration of data and facts before some of these things get done. But at the end of the day, Mississippi is as financially and economically healthy as we've been in quite some time. And hopefully that will continue for a while. The interesting thing is we usually kind of lag the rest of the country. But look, I'm kind of bearish as a matter of principle. That doesn't always bode well for kind of talking about financial issues. But I'm still kind of bearish on the economy, and I fear that we've not seen all the pain ahead, and that's going to, I think, be a big issue in upcoming legislative sessions. Because if we start seeing our state budget sort of revert to where it had been before this big infusion of money started hitting a few years ago, it's going to create a lot of challenges that they're just not really facing right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. Also got a report this morning, you probably saw that on retail sales for February. They came in lower than expected. So, again, when might that hit Mississippi? Because that would affect the sales tax revenue and income tax revenue. So many of our businesses are passed through, and when their sales are down, well, then they pay less income taxes and they produce fewer sales taxes, revenue that goes to the state. Ash, appreciate you joining us and enjoyed the conversation, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Gerard. Have a great one.
You too. We're going to step aside for a break right here on Middays. We're coming right back.